Thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I'm actually really glad that you're here because I've got a lot of really fascinating research that I want to share with you. And I'm going to start by talking about something called the Playpump. And the Playpump is something that was invented by Trevor Field, a South African guy, in 1995. And it seemed like a very basic invention. He connected a children's roundabout to a water pump, which would mean that as children played on this playground ride, they would be generating water for their local communities. In 2000, it won a World Bank Development Award out of 3,000 applicants. That really brought it into the public eye, and then it began being funded by the CEO of AOL at the time. Shortly after that, it gained a lot of media attention and very quickly raised tens of millions of dollars. It was even supported by Bill Clinton and the First Lady, and Jay-Z did a concert to raise awareness for it. By 2009, there were 1,800 play pumps across Africa. But unfortunately, the play pump was a terrible idea because there had been quite a few design oversights that had been made. For example, roundabouts are fun because when you push them, they spin freely. But in order to pump water, the play pump had to be pushed continuously, which meant that children very quickly got bored. In some villages, they were even paid to continue playing on the play pump. And when they did play on it, they would often fall off and be injured, with stories of broken bones being quite common. Eventually, women of the village would take over and were very indignant at the fact they would have to push around this children's toy in order to pump water for their village. And in fact, when they asked the local communities what they thought about the play pumps many years later, they found out that they had never even wanted them in the first place. And if you compare it to a very basic Zimbabwe bush pump, like this, the play pump was 4 times as expensive and only pumped 1/5 of the amount of water. But most importantly, when the play pumps broke down, which they often did, they needed to be repaired by a specialist team. But these specialist teams were almost never called out, which meant that these small communities had their water supply capped by broken play pumps with no repair in sight. And what this example represents is the difference between good intentions and good results. The question I want to address in this talk is, how can we ensure that we are doing good by our actions? To give another example, a personal experience of mine, I used to work as a chef in a kitchen, and that meant at the end of a shift I would have tips. And when I cycled home through the city where I lived, there were lots of homeless people by the side of the road. And I wanted to do as much good as I could, but for some reason, after several years of working there, I never had the courage to give my money to these people, despite the fact that they definitely needed it far more than I did. And I think the reason for that is that I had a few questions that had no answers. At least I thought they had no answers, such as, if I give them my money, will they not just be hungry again by the next day? And if I really want to make a difference, should I save my money and take it home and do something even more significant with it? And I had no answers to this question until I found out about effective altruism. It's a fairly new social movement / research field. And today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the basic principles of effective altruism, or EA, so that you have an answer to the same questions that I had. The basic principle is this: using evidence and rationality to do the most good. So what that means is using the compassion and empathy that we feel for other people and our love for other people to motivate us to use numbers, rationality, reason to do the most good, to do it effectively. This results in a very basic 2-step process: figuring out how to do the most good and then actually doing it, regardless of what that happens to be. And if that sounds really simple, then I think you'd be amazed at some of the results that have come out of the effective altruism movement. On that note, I want to talk a bit about the history of humanity, very briefly. This chart represents the income of every human on Earth. Starting from down here, the very poorest people on Earth, And at the end, the wealthiest people on Earth, of course, this graph actually scales far higher than you can possibly see. And I'd like you to estimate where you think you are on this graph. Okay. Most Westerners estimate that they're in the top 20%, so that's about here. But when you graduate, the minimum graduate wage in the UK is £18,000, and that will mean that you are here. Now that's your first day on your new job after graduating. If we assume that with a degree your wages increase throughout your lifetime, if we average that amount, the amount that you earn year on year, you end up being in the 1%. So if you come out of here with a degree, that means you're very likely to be in the 1%, the 1% richest people on Earth. That means that you are at the top of this graph, somewhere along here, and you are magnitudes wealthier than the majority of every other human that is not only alive today, but has ever lived. For most of humanity, we all lived on around $1 to $2 a day, and a lot of the people alive today are still living on that amount. Of course, we're now earning far greater amounts, and that's an exciting thing because it means that we have a really immense opportunity to do good in the lives of other people. If we look at the bottom 20%, that's 1.4 billion people earning less than about £1 a day. Maybe you're a bit skeptical about that number. Maybe you think, well, your money goes further when you go abroad. But that's already been taken into account. Then maybe you think, well, these people are growing a lot of their own food, so earning £1 a day really wouldn't be so bad. They can provide for themselves. But that has already been taken into account. So if they grow 50 pence worth of their own food and consume it, then that has been included in the amount of their income. So these people are producing and consuming only £1 worth of value every single day, and they need that in order to survive. And maybe think about what you can buy for £1 in the campus shop. It's not a lot. And so maybe you're thinking, well, surely they would die, but of course the answer is a lot of them do. The fact that we're so far ahead means that a lot of the solutions to these people's problems are incredibly cheap. £1 in your hand can't really benefit you very much. You might be able to buy some food for yourself, you'd be a bit less hungry, but there's already plenty of stuff in the fridge. Whereas £1 to, say, a typical Indian farmer means that they don't have to provide food for themselves for a day, so they can travel to the hospital. Or maybe they're able to buy some infrastructure which allows them to produce much more food, but they've never been able to afford it because they're living day on day. They can never build any savings. What's staggering is how much of a difference it makes between your hand and someone else's hand. This graph, as you can see, is life satisfaction plotted against income. So it goes from 4 to 8. People were asked in massive surveys how satisfied they were with their life on a scale of 1 to 10 in all the countries all over the world. And what's really fascinating is that if you look at the x-axis, it doubles at each interval. Now what that means is, in order for you to achieve an increase in life satisfaction, your income needs to double. And so if we want to increase the life satisfaction of a graduate student, that would cost £18,000. But increasing the life satisfaction by the same amount of an Indian farmer would only cost £150. Now that is a more than 100 times difference. Within the Effective Altruism community, the staggering difference between what we can do for ourselves and what we can do for other people has become known as the 100x multiplier. So maybe imagine that there's a happy hour at your local pub, whereby buying a drink for someone else is 99% off. If that were the case, I think we would all be very generous. It's not very often that we have two options and one of them is 100 times better than the other. The effective altruism movement was kind of born out of a thought experiment by Peter Singer called The Drowning Child, and it goes a bit like this. Say you are walking down the road and over in the distance you hear a cry, and you walk over and investigate and you see a small child drowning in a pond. Immediately you're overcome by the instinct to jump in and help them, but you're wearing your best suit and some brand new shoes, and wading in would certainly ruin them. But of course I think we would all agree that your clothes are nowhere near as significant as the child's life, and so you wade in and save them. I think this illustration serves as a good example of how you might experience this. It's an exciting opportunity to be significant for someone else's life, to make a difference in the world. Of course, what you might realize is that we are making this call every single day, the difference between our clothes and another person's life. But of course, we shouldn't have any guilt about that because the opportunity doesn't present itself. No one calls to us to do that. And as we just saw, charities tend to be very ineffective at creating change. So then the question is, do we really have that power for change? If a charity isn't going to do an effective job, then who is? And so the question really is, how can we make the most impact possible? And there are 5 principles that effective altruism has introduced which answer this question. And this is where I'd like to ask you to join in with a little task. I've set each table. You all have the same. I wonder if you could each turn over the top sheet on your table. And I'm going to read out a task here. It says, your team is in control of a hospital budget. It is your responsibility to provide the best outcome possible with the money available. 3 incredibly effective new health programs have been developed. Which program should you implement in order to do the most good? The 3 options are treating mild depression for £400 a person, treating earache for £6 a person, or treating liver disease for £1,200 per person. Now, time is short and people are dying, so you've got 2 minutes in your tables to discuss this and tick the answer that you have decided. Okay. Well, I've been easy with you on the first one. There's not necessarily a right answer for this one because they're fairly even in terms of how effective they are. I think you could probably agree that it was tough to choose. And the reason is we need more information, really. You probably felt quite harsh by having to choose between the suffering of 2 or 3 different people because, of course, providing treatment for one would have meant neglecting the other. But in our world, that's exactly what happens. Every single day, people are dying, and we have to make calculated decisions about who we help and who we don't because we don't have unlimited resources. And maybe it felt like guesswork, but if you read the Salvation Army's website, then you see that they provide soup kitchens, community support for vets, emergency homeless shelters, and summer camps, after-school programs. And they break down their finances into broad categories like rehabilitation and buildings and other. But of course, that doesn't provide any information on how many people benefit or by how much. And so it's also very much like the situation you just experienced in the real world, where there is not enough information for people to decide where and how they should give their money or work to do the most good. There is one way to compare the things that you've looked at on the table, though, and that is using something called a QALY. That's a quality adjusted life year. Now, what that means is 1 QALY is equal to 1 year of perfectly good health. So if we look at this graph of quality of life against time, maybe this is someone who has been born with some kind of disease which limits their quality of life to about 60%, and they live to around 60, 65 years old. We can calculate the quality of their life by multiplying 60% by 60, 65 years. Now, what that means is when we're trying to improve someone's life, when we're trying to make a difference in other people's lives, we've got two options. And that is, number one, to increase the quality of their life for the 60, 65 years, or number two, to extend their life at its current quality. You don't have to do all of the maths here. Maybe it doesn't seem intuitive that you should be able to put a number on different illnesses. But they've done a huge amount of surveys to find out how bad it is to have different types of illness. And so the three you just looked at are on this list. Ear pain causes a 0.018 reduction in your life satisfaction. Having liver disease is 0.5, and then having depression is about a 0.159 reduction. What 0.5 in terms of liver disease means that having liver disease is half as good as having a year without liver disease. And we can use QALYs as a metric for working out which kind of health and social programs provide the most benefit. It's not all guesswork. But we won't have to split hairs between different numbers. I mean, a lot of these numbers are almost the same, if not similar. The important thing about effective altruism is that some of the things that we could do are hundreds of times better than others, and so it's a no-brainer which one we should choose. For example, if we want to treat blindness, you've kind of got two options. Maybe you want to help people who are already blind, and so you decide that you're going to give your money to training guide dogs. On the other hand, you could prevent blindness from happening in the first place with a trachoma vaccination. And I've shown you the least graphic image I could find here, I promise. Giving a guide dog is great because it means that they can get around, they have some support there, whereas preventing blindness from happening at all would mean that you are allowing someone to have perfectly good sight for their entire life. Giving a guide dog doesn't cure the blindness at all, so it's only a very small improvement in that person's life. But training a guide dog costs $40,000, whereas a trachoma vaccination costs $100. And so that is a 400 times difference in terms of how much good we can do if we send our money elsewhere. Of course, that's also not considering how much better it is to not be blind at all rather than just having a dog. So it's even more than 400 times better to send your money elsewhere. Now, I'm not saying that guide dogs should be exterminated, because, of course, they're still doing an incredibly valuable thing, but there are people who are having more severe problems that could be solved for cheaper. So if you're donating money to a guide dog charity, you have an opportunity to do a huge amount more by looking at the statistics and the data that show us what the best treatment really is. And this is how effective altruists think. You find the most effective action, in that case it would have been the trachoma treatment, and then you do it until something else is more effective. The second principle I want to introduce is the good versus the best, similar to what we've just seen. So the second task on your table: your team works in Nigeria for a charity that hopes to increase the levels of education for children in poverty. It's your responsibility to find out which social programs produce the best results. 4 programs are being tested in different villages so that their performance can be compared against a control group. Each program is allocated the same amount of money. In your report, you must predict the order that you think these programs will come in terms of effectiveness from 1 to 4. And you've got 2 minutes to discuss. Maybe you found it really difficult to compare social programs which have no relevance to each other. There seems to be no way to compare the outcomes of the two. But there are, and that's through something called RCTs, or randomized controlled trials. So this is where you take one group of people and you give them no treatment, you apply no social program to them. And then you take another group and you test a social program, and then you compare the two. How much difference was there? What difference did it make? So if we compare the results of the interventions that I had on the screen, if we look at additional years of additional schooling per $1,000 of these 4 interventions, you can see that the first one, cash transfers to girls, produces 0.2 years of additional school per $1,000. Merit scholarships produce 3, and free school uniforms produce 7. But then, if we look at intestinal worm vaccinations, which seems a little bit odd, we get this result. So this really proves the point that the good interventions are not as good as the best interventions by quite a long way. Deworming makes a difference because the biggest problem in African education is absenteeism, people not turning up. And the biggest cause of that is illness, or especially intestinal worms. And so providing a vaccination to children produces the biggest increase in education out of all of these social programs. And because the vaccinations are so inexpensive, it's by a really massive margin. That's a really important point because it makes all of the mathematics and the testing and the research worth it when we get results that allow us to choose the most effective programs. The third principle I want to talk about is neglectedness. And so you have one more task on your table. This one's pretty straightforward. Which is more valuable, water or diamond? I'll give you just a minute to discuss this. Okay, I'm going to have to stop you again. That might have seemed like a really simple question, but as I'm sure you then realised, it's a bit complicated. Well, that demonstrates the difference between average value and marginal value. Water has a really high average value because it's essential to us, which means that each unit of water is more valuable to us as a human. We need it to survive, but because there's so much of it, it has an incredibly low value. It's inexpensive. In the US, it costs, I think, $0.015 for a gallon of water, whereas diamond is completely useless to us, really, but because there's so few of them, they have an incredibly high marginal value, which means that if you find a diamond, it is incredibly valuable. Finding another gallon of water would not help you very much. And maybe if you think about a sweater as an example, if you're homeless and you're given a sweater, then that's an incredibly valuable gift. Whereas if you live in a comfortable home and you have 10 sweaters already, then being given another sweater is incredibly not helpful. In fact, it might even be a burden. You can't fit them all in your drawers anymore. So you have to think about how valuable is your contribution in an area, as well as just how valuable is what you're actually doing. How much difference do you make to what was already there? That allows us to decide which areas to focus on. So, for example, if you look at international aid, on March the 11th, 2011, an earthquake struck the Tohoku region in Japan, and 15,000 people died. Then in May the 12th, 2008, another earthquake struck in the Sichuan region of China, but this was almost entirely unheard of. Barely anyone, it was not in the news whatsoever, whereas the earthquake in Japan was in every major headline across the world. And what that meant was Japan received $5 billion donations in aid, whereas in China they received $0.5 billion. The thing that's quite significant here is that Japan has the 4th wealthiest income per capita in the world. And so they didn't really need the money that they were getting. And in fact, it became such a problem that the Japanese Red Cross issued this statement. The Japanese Red Cross Society has determined that external assistance is not required and is therefore not seeking funding or other assistance from donors at this time. They had to stop people from giving them money because they literally couldn't use it for any good. If you look at the amount of dead, maybe 15,000 people died in Japan, 87,000 people died in China. So it makes a lot more sense. If the money that you would have given to China would have made a lot more difference. They didn't have the money, they didn't have the resources, and it would have gone. They needed to provide shelter and homes for far more families than they did in Japan. So it seems clear then what we should do. We should give to China in terms of, we should give to the biggest international aid crises that go unnoticed. But actually, 18,000 children die every day from preventable diseases. And what that means is that almost no one is tackling it to the magnitude that people are responding to these natural disasters. Our brains respond to natural disasters and they don't respond to everyday emergencies. So what that means is tackling neglectedness, doing the most effective thing you can sometimes mean doing counterintuitive things, such as refusing to give to international aid and instead diverting your money towards tackling ongoing poverty. Now, the second to last principle I want to talk about is the counterfactual. And this means what would have happened otherwise. So if you didn't intervene, if you didn't do something, what would happen anyway? So there's one more task on the table, if you turn it over. It says, as a child, you wanted to save lives. Therefore, you trained for years and became a doctor, working in a UK hospital. After a few years, you begin to wonder how much difference you're making. Perhaps you should work in a poorer country that needs more doctors, and perhaps you should work in a rich country and give money to charity. So you can work in the UK and donate 50% of your income, you can work in Brazil and donate 20% of your income, or you can work in Kenya and donate none. And you've got another 2 minutes to discuss. This task actually represents a real scenario. So a man called Greg Lewis, he looks a bit scruffy, but regardless, he was in this exact same situation. He grew up wanting to be a doctor, but he was curious after several years of working in the industry how many lives he was really saving. What are the returns on an additional doctor to the system? By the way, he was working in the UK at the time. Health economists calculate that one life is equal to about 36.5 QALYs, just for reference. So if you provide a lot of small benefits to people's lives, if they add up to 36.5, you've essentially saved a life. He wanted to consider the average value of doctors versus the marginal value. So what difference did it make between the 800,000 doctors already in America? This is statistics from the 800,000 doctors already in America to become the 800,000th and one. How much difference does that make? Also, diminishing returns. The biggest illnesses and the biggest injuries would already have been treated. They would not have been neglected. So the only remaining treatments that are currently being ignored because they don't have enough time are the most minor illnesses. Of course, the most serious are treated first. Also, there are limited places at medical school. So if he was to not get into the medical school, somebody else would have done, and he would have been perhaps slightly not as good as Greg, but it would have been a very narrow margin. Now, what that means is he calculated that over his life, using lots of other statistics, adding a doctor to the UK system would have saved 1 or 2 lives throughout his entire career, which isn't very much, maybe. Of course, that's still an incredible thing. So he's saving lives, but he was disappointed by the amount of difference he was making. So another option was to go and work in Africa. Now, this would have meant that he would have been saving a total of 140 lives because of the fact that they are more in need of well-trained professionals. But of course, if he was to go and work in Africa, then he would be taking someone else's place. So this could have been much higher. So what could he do that nobody else would? And what he actually decided to do was earning to give. This is an effective altruism concept, although I suppose it's kind of been around for a lot longer than that in other forms, which meant that he stayed in the UK and he decided to give 50% of his income to charity. And he gave it to the most effective charity he could find, which meant that over his career he ended up saving 640 lives. In QALYs, at least. And so the difference between 1 to 2 and 640 is a hugely significant amount, as I'm sure you can agree. Now, the answer to what the scenario we just went through, the answer to that would not have been the same for everyone, because some doctors would not have been able to cope with being away from home for so long. They wouldn't have performed well if they were in Brazil or Kenya. Maybe some people are claustrophobic. They want to get out of their home country, so they would have performed better traveling elsewhere. Maybe you are... what I'm trying to point out is that we have a lot of options. It depends on who you are as a person, what the most effective action really is. So, considering where you work best, how much money you earn doing different things, where you have the most potential for making a difference, doing things that other people wouldn't have done. By giving money to charity, Greg was doing something that other people weren't doing, at least not nearly on a 50% scale. Also, a consideration to make is that in effective altruism, a lot of the causes that are of highest priority require more talent than they require resources. The effective altruism community has got the attention of a lot of wealthy people, and so they now have a lot of funding for things. But what they don't have is people who are interested in researching, people who are interested in creating solutions to these problems. And so, if you don't feel like you have money to give, which I certainly don't, what is more in need is your time, your talents, and your interest. Last principle, and the last sheet on your table, talking about what are the chances. So the last task is, you're an ambitious team of students and you want to do the most good that you can throughout your life. You've decided to make a commitment to do one of the following. Now, when you choose, bear in mind everything we've talked about already. You could volunteer weekly at a homeless shelter, you could read political news and vote, or you could research how to prevent aliens destroying the Earth. And you've got 2 minutes. And who chose to research preventing alien destruction? Nice. All right. This is an opportunity for me to introduce the idea of expected value. How could we ever work out which one to choose in a situation like this? It kind of comes down a bit more to personal preference than anything we've seen before. Maybe you're thinking, surely it's unlikely that trying to prevent aliens from destroying the Earth is going to make any help. It's not needed. But to represent a point, if we look at the Comprehensive Accident Management Plan of Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Power Plant, it's quoted as saying this: the possibility of a severe accident occurring is so small that from an engineering standpoint, it is practically unthinkable. And then that happened. Humans really struggle with incredibly unlikely things. The chances are not zero, but they're so small that we almost equate them as being zero. We don't prepare for the eventuality that it does happen. Now, this again allows us to focus on where we should work. Should we work on things that are predictably good, such as volunteering at a homeless shelter, or should we work on things which are unlikely but incredibly bad, such as an alien destruction? And the answer kind of comes down to the amount of risk that you're willing to accept. You can make the same amount of difference doing something that is incredibly likely but not that great, or doing something which has an incredibly large payoff but is incredibly unlikely. So personally, I'm very interested in things like alien invasions that could cause a huge amount of damage but are incredibly unlikely. That varies depending on person to person. But I do want to explain something called the long-term future. And if you look at humankind has produced a huge amount of value over the period of its existence. We've built pyramids, we've made paintings. For some reason, these are upside down. They're behind the thing. Okay, yeah, we get the point. We've done a lot of stuff. And the point of these images here, especially this one, is that assuming that we become interplanetary, the human species will continue for, mammalian species exists for an average of around 2 million years, but we are not just an average mammalian species, we're incredibly intelligent, which means that we'll probably outlive that. And then if the sun burns up and destroys the Earth, we'll already be interplanetary, we'll be in other solar systems. So the future of the human race is immensely vast. And so if you want to prevent an alien invasion, you're not just preventing the deaths of everyone that's alive now, and all of this, you're also preventing the destruction of the future of humanity by preventing things that could destroy us all. These things being existential risks. So, for example, really super intelligent artificial intelligence could destroy us if it doesn't go well. Global pandemics could destroy us because we have more abilities than ever to create deadly viruses. There are a lot of existential threats that the effective altruism community is trying to halt from happening, even though it's incredibly, incredibly unlikely. There's a huge amount to gain from it. So very quickly, how should we decide what to work on? Firstly, how much do you gain? Secondly, how neglected is it? Is everyone else already working on it? And thirdly, tractability, which means how solvable is it? If you're trying to do something that's incredibly impractical, then you'll be wasting your time. There's a few things that stand out on this with these metrics, namely poverty, factory farming, and the existential risks. But there are a huge amount of other very important causes that you may feel more strongly drawn towards. All of these have a huge amount of potential for positive work, and so if you feel like you want to work on one of these, then they're in need of your contribution. All of these fields need not just people to donate money, they need economists, they need researchers, scientists, designers, architects. These issues are so large that they span every industry, every career. And so that's where the EA community comes in. It's all about working together, combining our skills and making more difference as a whole than we could do individually. It's a fairly new community, but people are making things happen all over the world already. People are starting companies, holding events, creating charities, and the fact that it's now coming towards Cornwall shows that it's getting pretty large. Here's the latest EA Global event, and a pretty impressive turnout, but still growing fast. What this means is that if you get involved with effective altruism, you can guarantee that the work that you do is valued because it's in some of the most essential areas of life. You also have ways to work out what to do next every single time. You're never left wondering what to do. Your opinions are valued because it's based on ration and reason. So if you've come to a conclusion, then it's definitely worth listening to. You're part of a committed and a driven community of people that are trying to do the most good, and that you can have a far bigger impact as a collective than you can as an individual. In future, I'd like to do more talks on this subject, such as fair trade and sweatshops, a career guide on how you can make an impact individually, also covering some of the most common objections to effective altruism. And so I'd love to talk to you. I've put my details there. But also, if you want to read more about it, there's a couple places to search down here. Very quickly, Daisy. Daisy, I forgot to mention at the start, came all the way down from Exeter. She's from the Effective Altruism Society in Exeter. Did I miss anything?
Not really. Guys, this is going to be really good. If you're a bit like, I don't know what to do with my life, but I know that I want to make a difference in the world, like, this is going to affect you, and you don't even know how much until you start getting involved, because that was me 2 years ago, and I just didn't know anything. I got involved with this, and it's really life-changing. It really, truly is. So if you value any of the same values as we do, try on getting involved. Yeah.
Okay. And so basically what I'm trying to say is if you want to make the biggest impact possible, then this is the place to do it, because this is a community of people who are committed on making the biggest impact physically possible. So in summary, I want to thank you so much for coming, and I would now take your questions, but there's people knocking on the door. So I'm going to say we go talk outside. I'm going to go to the stannery and get a drink because I'm a bit thirsty.